Today I want to talk a little bit about labor market, and this is a particularly interesting labor market, the market for talent in the National Basketball Association. And I think it's a pretty interesting market for a couple of reasons. Prospective employees are subject to intense and endless scrutiny by fans, media, and teams before a draft, in which they're assigned one employer with which they have to bargain with for the next 4 years of their basketball careers. After the draft, they're signed to contracts that are worth tens of millions of dollars, and they get a lot of this money before they even set foot in an NBA gym. And once they do start playing, their performance is easily measured through dozens of statistics. It's endlessly parsed by fans, commentators, bloggers, newspapers, and it's broadcast live around the world. And though just a couple hundred job seekers get to even think about participating in this labor market each year, it captures the imaginations of millions, from schoolyards to college gyms to rec centers. But this isn't just about sports. If such a high visibility, high stakes labor market can't properly function, if it can't properly predict performance and assign pay, then there's little hope for the more mundane labor markets that a lot of us on campus who don't happen to have the last name Luck face. The markets for new analysts at investment banks, new consultants at consultancies, or new computer engineers at software companies. And frequently, from the people that know this business, the owners, the media, and the fans, you hear just that. You hear that the system is broken. The rookies are paid too much, they say. How could you possibly give $10 million of guaranteed money to a guy who's played basketball in high school for a couple of years and has had 1 year of college experience? Now, there are a couple questions, two simple ones, that I've focused my empirical analysis of the NBA draft on. First, are rookies overpaid? Now, in the context of strained labor relations in 3 of the 4 major North American sports leagues, the issue of rookie salaries has become a very serious one. And in fact, the National Football League is right now looking to institute a rookie pay scale, similar to the one that the NBA currently uses. And the second question is, are teams rational and consistent in the way that they value and draft players? The owners face incredibly strong market incentives to do the rational and right thing. But do they still fall victim, like the rest of us, to all of the pathologies you see described in the judgment and decision-making literature? Are the picks that are most sought after, the lottery picks, really the most valuable? And are the owners rationally maximizing the surplus value that they get from all of these picks? In answering this question, I've calculated the surplus value of each individual pick in the draft. And there are 3 components to this calculation. The first is an estimation of the performance value of a player season. So I do this because the owners have, to some extent, revealed their preferences in the course of signing veteran players in free agency. Through a regression analysis of the contracts of veteran players in the 5th to 7th year of their careers, and lagged performance over the 4 prior years, I've found the value that owners place on performance. That is what they are willing to pay in the open free agent market for a specific level of production from an NBA player. And because free agents are free to sign with any team that they want, this performance value is the unfettered market measure of performance. So from performance value, I subtract compensation. Now it can be argued that the billionaire owners that are running around the NBA don't really care about money. But they do care about the NBA salary cap. And there are a couple exceptions. Some contracts don't count towards the cap, and wealthy owners can exceed the cap if they're willing to pay a luxury tax. But for the purposes of this analysis, I do assume that the owners do face a cap constraint. And I count compensation as the annualized version of a player's salary and bonus. So subtracting compensation from performance value gives us surplus value. And I calculate surplus value for the first 4 seasons of a rookie's career. These, remember, are the 4 seasons to which the drafting team owns the exclusive rights to their basketball services. Surplus value is the difference between a rookie's pay and what a veteran would get paid on the open free market for the exact same level of production. Now, any interpretation of the surplus value that I've calculated for drafted players is dependent upon the proper estimation of the compensation equation, which I use to predict the performance values. In estimating this equation, I used a sample of 324 NBA players drafted between 2000 and 2005 who are in years 5 to 7 of their careers. There's 5 parameters that I've used in estimating this equation. The first, and most important, is obviously performance. And I used the weighted average of 4 years of lagged performance using a per-minute efficiency measurement, which comes from John Hollinger's PER formula, which is widely accepted in the literature. I use a linear spline technique, which allows me to separate productivity into 3 different categories: a bottom tier, a middle tier, and a top tier. And doing this gives me the flexibility to really capture the differentiated performance you see at the very top of the production scale, accounting for just how much better players like LeBron James and Kobe Bryant are. The other parameters here are indicator variables for position and year in league, dummy variables accounting for players that miss entire seasons, and a variable for draft position, which enters the equation just like performance in a linear spline with 2 knots. This compensation model actually does a pretty good job at explaining compensation. It accounts for a full 57% of the variation in player salary in my sample. But in estimating this compensation equation, I did encounter a couple of important specification issues. The first was the decision of including draft in the equation and how to do so. I found that including draft actually ended up having very little increase in the explanatory power of the equation. And the increase that it did have was probably coming through draft's influence on performance. So I determined this by estimating 2 compensation equations. The first equation that I estimated included performance residuals. That is, actual performance minus performance as explained solely through draft order. The second compensation equation included draft order explicitly. And it turned out that these 2 compensation equations had almost the exact same level of explanatory power. Now this means that draft order, if included explicitly, corrects for a specification error in how performance is entering my equation. This error can come from one of 2 places. Either the functional form is incorrect, perhaps a log linear relationship is not an appropriate way to model the relationship between compensation and performance, or perhaps the performance measures that I've chosen don't fully capture the performance value of a team or of a player to an NBA team. Including draft order explicitly also had one more important benefit. It ensures that my performance values are non-biased relative to draft order. And this becomes absolutely critical later on when I run a formal test of the relationship between these performance values and draft order. Another specification issue I encountered was what to do with past performance. It's obvious that seasons long ago matter less in determining compensation than seasons that are closer to the day that the contract was signed. So I employed a 15% discount rate for past seasons, which is in line with the industry average. I also encountered a sample bias in choosing veterans to determine my compensation equation. You run into a survivorship effect, where the players that are used to determine this compensation equation are unique in that they've survived to year 5 or 7 of their career. But I thought that this bias was outweighed by the benefit of including veteran players rather than newer players. Veterans have years of observable performance data on the record, and teams in setting compensation can look to this performance data instead of other characteristics like draft choice in determining pay. Once I estimated the compensation equation, I was able to predict performance for a sample of 1,174 player seasons, including every single player drafted in the NBA between 2002 and 2006 for the first 4 years of their career. I retained players who dropped out of the league in this sample to avoid a survivorship bias. So this is the result that you get. The 3 curves in this graph are the weighted averages of performance value, surplus value, and compensation. Now it's important to exercise some caution in interpreting this graph because these are weighted averages and don't represent the precise values. But the curves do suggest some very powerful implications. Recall that surplus value is the difference between what a player on a rookie contract is paid, that's the red compensation line, and what that same player would get paid in the free agent market for the same level of production. That's the green performance value curve. And note that that green performance value curve doesn't even get to the full marginal revenue product of a player, because even in the free agent market, salaries are limited by the salary cap. So let's get to those 2 implications. First, and pretty importantly, is that surplus value is positive for the length of the draft. That means that owners extract monopsony rents from every single player drafted from the 1st to the 60th. This means that because players in the NBA draft are only allowed to negotiate with one employer, the team that's drafted them, for the first 4 years of their contract, their salaries are held lower. And the owners collectively also exercise monopsony power in setting the rookie pay scale, which establishes maximum salaries for each individual pick in the first round of the draft, as negotiated with the players' union in the collective bargaining agreement. Second, and more surprising, is that you see that surplus value is declining pretty steadily throughout the draft. This means that the top picks, the ones in the lottery from picks 1 through 14, are actually experiencing the highest degree of monopsony exploitation. Now, this isn't what you'd think, right? Commonly, you hear people say, those guys that got selected at the top of the draft are making out like bandits. They're getting paid tens of millions of dollars, and they haven't even done anything yet. But it turns out that the players at the top of the draft are the ones that are actually being exploited the most. In fact, for the first pick, if his performance was compensated in line with the market forces that govern free agency, you'd probably see his salary triple. Now, the owners are really happy about this. This means that the top picks in the draft are the most valuable because they generate the maximum amount of surplus. And this runs contrary to the recent commentary that you've seen in the press that says these owners are irrational and that they're systematically overvaluing the top picks. In fact, they're getting the most bang for their buck at the top of the draft with the most sought-after picks, the lottery picks. But the smoothness of these curves is a little bit misleading. There is variation in performance around the mean. And for new players, this variation gets a lot of attention. After every draft, you'll hear a lot of commentary about who's going to be a bust or who might be an unexpected superstar. So what this graph is the mean of surplus value by draft pick. And it shows that the mean of the surplus value for each individual pick does decline pretty steadily over the length of the draft, but certainly not monotonically. And that's because of variation around the mean for performance for each individual pick. Performance has two components, one that is predicted from draft choice and one that is not. In my formal test of the relationship between surplus value and draft order, I've been able to control for this unpredictable component of performance. I do this by including performance residuals in my formal test. Remember that performance residuals are the difference between actual performance and performance that is explainable solely through draft order. Including this in the regression controls for that unpredictable component. Now, this is the formal test between draft order and estimated surplus. In addition to including performance residuals, I've also included controls for players that are not in the league anymore, they've dropped out and aren't getting paid, and players that do remain in the league but aren't getting any minutes. But the key parameter to look at here is draft order. I've regressed surplus on a linear spline of draft order with two knots, one at the end of the lottery pick, pick 14, and another at the end of the first round, pick 30. As you can see, this confirms exactly what we suspected by looking at the graph of surplus value a couple slides ago. Surplus value is increasing, and significantly so, for every region of the draft. The effect is particularly strong for the lottery picks, pick 1 through 14. In the lottery, moving up one pick, say from pick 10 to pick 9, leads to a $414,000 increase in surplus value to the owners. So it looks like we have answers to those two big questions about the draft that I asked at the beginning of the presentation. The first one, are rookies overpaid? Turns out to be absolutely not. In fact, the rookies are getting paid significantly less than they would have if they were able to market their services to the free market. And the second question, are these owners rational and consistent in the way that they draft picks? Turns out to be absolutely yes. Despite the recent prominence of arguments saying that the owners are systematically and irrationally overvaluing top picks in the draft, it turns out that the picks that they prize the most, the lottery picks, are in fact the most valuable to them because they can maximize surplus value at the beginning of the draft. Even after controlling for the portion of performance that is not explainable from draft order, the effect still holds. As you move up in draft pick, you move up in surplus value. So it looks like at the end of the day, it's the owners, not the players, that are really getting the best out of this market for new talent in the NBA. And they'll continue to do so as you see the collective bargaining agreement renegotiated in future years and as they renegotiate in the NFL today.